On April 21, 1944, at 6:32 a.m., Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell was standing next to a P-51 Mustang at Deben Airfield in England, observing Lieutenant James Parker, a 22-year-old pilot with 14 combat missions and 3 confirmed kills, as he approached the aircraft. The Germans had recently moved 90-48 mm flak batteries around Berlin, making Parker's bomber escort mission to Parcham highly dangerous. Mitchell had been servicing P-51 Mustangs for 7 months, intimately familiar with every aspect of the aircraft. It was a single-engine fighter featuring laminated wings that offered exceptional speed at all altitudes and boasted a range exceeding 1,600 miles when equipped with drop tanks. The Mustang was considered the world's top escort fighter. However, it had one critical flaw: its liquid-cooled engine. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine relied on an ethylene glycol coolant system that circulated through the engine block and brass tubes in the cylinder heads, then into a header tank behind the propeller before descending to a belly-mounted radiator via exposed lines. The entire system contained roughly 17 gallons of coolant. A single bullet striking any part of this setup would cause the engine to overheat within 3 to 7 minutes, leading to engine failure and requiring an immediate emergency landing or bailout over enemy territory. American combat doctrine instructed P-51 pilots to maintain high altitudes, avoid ground fire, concentrate on escort duties, use their speed and altitude advantage, and never descend low enough for small arms to reach them. Parker had adhered to this strategy during his previous 13 missions, but still managed to get hit. In the past 6 months, the 8th Air Force had lost more than 500 P-51 Mustangs, with most of these losses attributed not to German fighters but to ground fire, flak fragments, and rifle rounds that pierced the aluminum skin and severed coolant lines. Mitchell had witnessed numerous pilots return to base trailing white glycol vapor from their aircraft as engine temperatures soared past 100 °C, or the maximum limit of 100 °C. A few managed to return, but most did not survive. According to the training manual, tactical errors were cited as the primary cause of failure. However, instructors contended that the pilots were not adhering to established guidelines. Mitchell, however, held a different perspective. He believed the issue lay elsewhere, specifically with the cooling system of the P-51 Mustang. The aircraft's cooling mechanism was both elegant and efficient. It utilized the Meredith effect to mitigate some of the drag caused by the radiator, yet it remained dangerously vulnerable. Every coolant line ran openly through the plane's structure, making them susceptible to damage from enemy fire. The header tank was positioned just behind the propeller, one cased in thin aluminum that offered little protection. Meanwhile, the radiator hung below the aircraft's belly intake, exposed to any incoming threats. A mere .30 caliber bullet or a fragment of an 88 mm shell could easily penetrate these critical components and cause catastrophic damage. Once a leak occurred, there was no secondary system in place to prevent total failure. The coolant would pour out through the rupture. Temperatures would rise rapidly, leaving pilots with only minutes to decide whether to attempt reaching friendly territory or eject over hostile ground. 4 months earlier, Mitchell had brought this concern to the attention of the engineering officer. Despite his concerns, the officer maintained that the cooling system complied with all required specifications. The design was a joint effort between North American Aviation and Packard, who built the Merlin engines for the aircraft. All measurements were within acceptable limits. Modifying the design would necessitate a complete overhaul of the plane, which needed clearance from Wright Field in Ohio, located 4,000 miles away. Such adjustments could take several months or even years. The pilots couldn't afford to wait that long. Thus, Mitchell took whatever actions he could. He inspected every coolant connection prior to each flight, ensured all hose clamps met specifications and pressure, tested the header tank. He searched meticulously for any signs of cracks, corrosion, or weaknesses in the system. However, there were limitations. He couldn't reinforce the lines, introduce redundancy, or address the inherent vulnerability that every P-51 faced during combat operations. The first pilot to succumb to cooling system failure was Second Lieutenant David Chen on March 19, 1944. Chen had been stationed in theater for just 4 weeks. Mitchell had personally worked on his aircraft each morning. They often discussed California. Chen hailed from San Francisco, while Mitchell came from Los Angeles. Both men had experience working on cars before entering the military. Chen departed at 0645 for a fighter sweep over France. When he returned 3 hours later, his engine temperature gauge read 10.8 C, and there was a visible trail of white vapor trailing behind his plane. During a strafing run near Bov, Chen reported being hit by ground fire. A single small-caliber round had penetrated the belly skin of his aircraft and damaged a coolant line to the radiator. Immediately after the impact, he noticed the engine temperature rising rapidly. Chen discontinued his attack, initiated an ascent, and pointed his plane toward England. The engine remained operational for 18 minutes as Chen watched helplessly as both the temperature gauge continued its climb and the vapor trail thickened. With the knowledge that his engine was failing, Chen managed to cross the English Channel. He neared the coast of England and was within sight of Devon when the engine finally seized up 4 miles from the runway. In a desperate attempt to land safely, he tried gliding in, but it nearly succeeded. The Mustang ultimately crashed into a field 3 miles short of the airfield, flipping over on its back and disintegrating upon impact. Tragically, Chen perished in the crash. The official investigation concluded that pilot error was responsible for his demise, suggesting that he should have ejected over the channel when hit by ground fire, instead of attempting to return home with a damaged engine. However, Mitchell read the report and understood it to be incorrect. Chen had acted precisely as any seasoned pilot would, trying to save both his aircraft and returning to base despite knowing the risks involved. The failure of the cooling system was ultimately what led to Chen's death. The second pilot was First Lieutenant William Morrison, who served as a flight leader and had accumulated 9 aerial victories and completed 28 missions. He was intimately familiar with the P-51 aircraft, understanding both its advantages and limitations. Morrison's plane sustained damage from an 88mm shell that detonated near the left side of his aircraft without penetrating the cockpit or hitting any fuel tanks. The explosion sent shrapnel through the fuselage's left side, where a 3-inch-long piece severed the coolant line connecting the header tank to the radiator. Morrison promptly reported the issue over the radio, indicating that he had suffered a coolant leak and was experiencing rising temperatures. Despite these difficulties, he remained with the bomber formation for 6 more minutes until they completed their bombing run, continuing to protect them from German fighter planes even as his engine temperature surpassed 100 degrees Celsius. Once the bombers were out of danger, Morrison broke off, dropped out of formation, and headed westward into friendly territory over Holland. His wingmen maintained close proximity throughout this time. By then, Morrison's engine was operating at a dangerous 12 degrees Celsius, causing the cylinder heads to begin warping. Morrison attempted to tend to the issue by lowering engine power to its minimum setting and maintaining a nose-down position to increase airspeed and airflow for cooling purposes. At an altitude of 8,000 feet over Azoid, the engine seized up. He then tried to restart it but failed as it wouldn't turn over. Morrison opted for a forced landing on a beach along the Dutch coast. Though he nearly succeeded, the Mustang crashed upon impact. The landing gear gave way, and the plane cartwheeled across the ground. Morrison died instantly from the crash. Rodriguez, who was Morrison's crew chief and a friend of Mitchell's hailing from Texas, believed that the cooling system was prone to failure. He reviewed maintenance records for all P-51s lost in the preceding 3 months, finding 27 out of 42 aircraft were lost due to cooling system failures after sustaining battle damage. This resulted in the deaths of 27 pilots because a single hit had incapacitated their entire cooling systems. Official reports attributed these losses to tactical errors. Pilots should have stayed at higher altitudes and adhered strictly to doctrine, avoiding ground fire. However, Rodriguez presented combat reports to Mitchell that revealed most pilots were indeed following standard procedures. They were flying at altitude and escorting bombers when the flak reached them. Some were close acquaintances, while others he barely knew beyond brief encounters during pre-flight inspections. Nonetheless, he had meticulously serviced their aircraft, signed off on all maintenance logs, and ensured that each engine's coolant levels and radiator functions were in perfect order. Despite adhering strictly to protocol, the pilots still met tragic fates. The abrupt cessation of an engine's roar across the airfield was a grim harbinger of death. Mitchell had endured this 4 times. Twice the pilots managed to crash land safely, while 2 others perished without trace. Each morning, Mitchell reported for duty in the maintenance area, greeted by the familiar scent of ethylene glycol and hot metal, a potent reminder that engines were operational and planes were readied for combat. Not all would return. Some would limp back trailing smoke, others wouldn't come back at all. And yet every day Mitchell was there to repeat his duties, signing off maintenance forms and checking critical systems, knowing full well the danger each pilot faced from a single enemy bullet. On the evening of April 20th, 1944, Parker approached Mitchell in the hangar while he worked on his assigned P-51. Parker asked if there was anything additional Mitchell could do to safeguard the coolant system, acknowledging that he understood the risks involved. He had witnessed Morrison's fatal crash firsthand. Chen's crash was something he had witnessed firsthand, and it reinforced his fear of dying due to a random bullet hitting a coolant line. Looking at Parker, Mitchell could see the young man's terror and helplessness, knowing all too well that every low-level flight and encounter with anti-aircraft fire left him vulnerable. There wasn't anything Mitchell could do about the cooling system's inherent weaknesses. It was designed as is, with lines routed in a fixed manner and the radiator situated where it was. Although he could perform thorough checks and ensure there were no leaks, he couldn't reinforce or bulletproof the system itself. Parker acknowledged this, but still requested that Mitchell double secure every coolant connection just to be safe from potential vibration-induced loosening. Mitchell promised to carry out this additional precaution that evening. Working solo after 10 p.m., when most of the crew had retired for the night, he found himself in the quiet maintenance hangar, with only the distant hum of generators and the occasional buzz of insects providing background noise. He meticulously removed each cowling panel on Parker's P-51 to inspect every coolant connection, including those at the header tank, radiator inlet, outlet, and cylinder head manifolds. Despite these efforts, Mitchell knew it still might not provide substantial protection. It wouldn't stop a bullet, but if vibrations caused a clamp to loosen or a connection began to leak, having a second clamp might buy enough time for the pilot to reach safety. The repair work took 3 hours, and by the end, his hands were soaked in glycol. His back was sore from bending over the engine, yet every joint now had double clamps ensuring additional security. Mitchell then replaced the cowling panels, cleaned up his tools, and exited the hangar at 0:15 a.m. The night air was chilly and damp, and he could hear distant aircraft engines, likely RAF bombers setting out on a mission. This sound made his stomach tighten with anxiety. In 6 hours, Parker would take off, and by 7 hours into the flight, Parker would be over Germany. There was nothing Mitchell could do to safeguard him from a single bullet that might end his life. Parker took to the skies. From the flight line, Mitchell watched as the P-51 climbed towards the morning sky with 16 aircraft forming up and heading southeast toward their target. He returned to the maintenance shack and waited anxiously. The mission lasted 4 hours and 37 minutes before the formation began its return journey at 11:29 a.m. When the planes came into view, he noticed one was missing from the group of 15 that had landed safely back home. Mitchell kept track of them as they began their descent for landing. He didn't spot Parker's plane among them. An hour later, the operations officer approached with news. Parker had been struck by flak over their target area. Other members of the formation noticed his plane emitting vapor trails shortly after that. Parker reported the issue himself, coolant leaking and the temperature rising. Despite this, he stayed behind to cover the bombers for an additional 10 minutes as his engine overheated past 100 degrees Celsius. Eventually, he broke away from the group, heading west in a bid to return safely. The last sighting of him was over western Germany, where he appeared to be losing altitude with a vapor trail extending behind him and his engine temperature exceeding 110 degrees Celsius. Parker neither ejected nor crashed. Instead, he simply vanished into thin air. Perhaps he landed somewhere undetected or managed to keep his aircraft aloft long enough for an emergency landing. Perhaps he had become a prisoner of war, or perhaps the engine had failed at 5,000 feet, forcing Parker to crash, land without any chance to bail out. It would be months before they knew for sure. Perhaps not until the war's conclusion. That evening, Rodriguez visited Mitchell's workspace and shared news about Parker's fate. He also mentioned that 6 other P-51s had been lost that week due to cooling system damage. 3 pilots were dead, 2 remained missing, and 1 was severely injured from a crash landing. Rodriguez expressed frustration with the current situation. When asked what could be done differently, Mitchell explained that the P-51 was an aircraft as it stood, and there was no way to redesign its cooling system on the ground. They lacked permission to add armor or make modifications without proper authorization. As a result, pilots continued to perish while these rules were being followed strictly. However, things started to change in how the 8th Air Force carried out missions. By late April 1944, Major General James Doolittle made a decision that would alter everything. The new missions required P-51 pilots to fly low, engage in strafing runs, and expose themselves to ground fire. This made the vulnerability of their cooling systems particularly dangerous. These missions were initially called fighter sweeps, but later became known as Chattanooga missions when they targeted railroads and locomotives. The P-51 pilots relished the newfound freedom, allowing them to hunt, attack, and bring the fight to the Germans rather than waiting for attacks. However, losses increased dramatically right away. In May 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 1930 P-51s, with 41% of those casualties resulting from strafing missions due to ground fire, small arms, light flak, punctured coolant systems, seized engines, and downed pilots. The statistics were grim. A P-51 pilot had better chances in aerial combat against a Messerschmitt 9 than during a strafing run over a German airfield where the ground-based fire was relentless. Lieutenant Robert Hayes was among those pilots flying these new missions, having survived the losses of both Parker and Morrison. By May 19, 1944, he had completed 26 missions and achieved 5 aerial victories. That day, Hayes was involved in a fighter sweep over northeastern France. His squadron spotted a German supply column on the road near Reims. The convoy consisted of 6 trucks and 2 staff cars, all visible from an altitude of 4,000 feet. Hayes and his wingmen initiated a strafing run. At a distance of 800 yards, he opened fire with his .50 caliber machine guns. His rounds hit the lead truck on the road, causing it to ignite into flames. As Hayes pulled up to an altitude of 200 feet and began climbing away from the target area, he felt a sudden impact beneath his left foot, a sharp thud akin to someone kicking the cockpit floor. The engine temperature gauge instantly registered a 5-degree increase, followed by another 10 degrees within seconds. Attempting to communicate over the radio, Hayes was struck again, this time damaging his coolant system. The temperature continued to rise as he leveled off at 4,000 feet and headed west toward England. The glycol coolant was perishing. To prevent further overheating, he reduced power to minimum cruising speed. The climb in temperature halted at 10:06 degrees. Hayes quickly calculated the distance and time needed to reach his destination. He was 180 miles away from Devon, which would take him around 40 minutes of flight time at minimum cruise speed. According to the engine manual, the maximum continuous operating temperature was 110 degrees, leaving him with a buffer of just 4 degrees when he started. For 8 minutes, the temperature remained steady at 10:06 degrees before beginning to rise again. It climbed to 10:07 and then to 10:08 degrees. To enhance cooling airflow through the radiator, Hayes lowered the nose slightly, allowing airspeed to increase. The temperature stabilized at 10:08 degrees, giving him about 30 minutes of flying time left until reaching England. He had a mere 2-degree margin for safety. His wingman maintained close formation with him throughout the flight, closely observing the expanding vapor trail behind their aircraft. At 110 miles from Devon, the temperature reached the critical threshold of 110 degrees, the highest permissible limit. Hayes kept the engine power steady, knowing that any further increase in temperature could cause severe issues. At 70 miles out, with the temperature surpassing 105 degrees beyond the maximum allowable level, the engine started to run rough and exhibit noticeable vibrations in the control stick. This was a clear warning sign. If temperatures continued to rise, the cylinder heads would warp, valves would seize, and pistons might lock up within seconds. The cylinder heads were beginning to distort. Time was running short. At a distance of 50 miles from Devon, the exhaust trail started turning gray, indicating that coolant was now burning rather than merely evaporating. The temperature had reached 1114 degrees. The engine seemed on the verge of seizing at any moment. Hayes contacted the control tower to declare an emergency landing. He initiated a straight-in approach without time for the standard traffic pattern. As he neared the airfield, it became increasingly clear that every second counted. At 20 meters, then 10 meters, and finally 5 meters above the ground, the engine's noise intensified into a deafening roar. The temperature gauge hit 116 degrees as Hayes was only 3 miles from the runway. Suddenly, the propeller ceased to rotate. The engine had seized. He flew over the airfield boundary at an altitude of 200 feet, lowered the landing gear, touched down halfway along the runway, and came to a halt. The engine remained silent as steam and glycol vapor billowed from the cowling. Hayes deactivated the power supply, undid his restraints, and exited the plane. His hands were trembling uncontrollably, and his flight suit was drenched in sweat. He had narrowly escaped death by just 18 minutes. A single rifle round had punctured a coolant line. "15 minutes later, Hayes pointed out the damage to Mitchell, an entry hole located beneath the left side of the fuselage, near where it meets the wing route. The bullet appeared to be approximately .30 caliber in size. The projectile had penetrated the aluminum exterior, traversed through the aircraft's internal structure, and grazed the coolant return line from the radiator without being a direct hit. This slight impact was sufficient to create an opening roughly the diameter of a pencil lead, which allowed 17 gallons of coolant to drain over an 18-minute period. Mitchell examined the engine and found that the cylinder head on the number 3 cylinder had fractured, with the valve seats on cylinders 4 and 5 having separated. The pistons were visibly scored as well, rendering the entire Merlin engine unusable beyond repair. Although Hayes managed to bring the aircraft back safely, the damage inflicted upon the engine was catastrophic. That evening, Rodriguez assisted Mitchell in removing the damaged engine. Underneath portable lighting, they loosened the engine mounts and disconnected the coolant lines before lowering the Merlin onto a stand. By then, both the header tank and radiator were completely empty. Each drop of coolant had leaked out through a pencil-sized hole. Rodriguez noted that this marked his 14th cooling system failure in just 6 weeks. 14 aircraft were either damaged or lost, with 8 pilots dead, 3 missing, and 3 injured, every single incident resulting from damage to the cooling system. He emphasized the need for action, but Mitchell argued there was no viable solution. It wasn't possible to armor the coolant lines or install a backup system. The P-51 was an outstanding aircraft plagued by inherent design flaws that were built into every aspect of its construction. Its cooling system was an engineering marvel, featuring 2 distinct systems within a single radiator assembly. One cooled the engine and held 16.5 gallons of coolant at 30 pounds per square inch pressure. The other managed supercharger charge regulation with 5 gallons at 20 pounds per square inch pressure. Both utilized a mix of ethylene glycol and water, typically in a ratio of 30% glycol to 70% water. This mixture raised the boiling point sufficiently to allow operation up to 1 diom Ponsive without boiling over. However, exceeding this temperature caused cylinder heads to warp, valves to seize, and seals to deteriorate. The engine would inevitably fail under extreme conditions. Mitchell had witnessed this scenario occur multiple times before. Pilots often pushed past a non-10 Celsius, hoping to make it back safely. The engine might continue running for a few minutes, but would eventually seize without prior warning. All mechanics and pilots were aware of the temperature limitations. However, knowing these limits did not provide any additional assistance in preventing failure. Even if the coolant was steadily leaking through a bullet hole, reducing power or fully opening the radiator flap made little difference once the coolant supply diminished. The system lacked any reserve capacity, backup tank, or emergency cooling measures. Once coolant loss began, there were only minutes left before overheating occurred. If you were unfortunate, it could take as little as 3 minutes. If fortunate, 7 minutes might be available. The size of the hole dictated how quickly the coolant would drain. The larger the aperture, such as from a 20-minute shell, the faster the coolant would deplete in 2 minutes. A smaller hole, like one caused by a rifle round, might allow for up to 8 minutes before critical levels were reached. Regardless of the circumstances, once the temperature rose too high, the engine would seize, and the pilot would be forced to land wherever they could. Rodriguez mentioned that other aircraft utilized liquid-cooled engines, such as the P-38 Lightning, wondered why the P-51 appeared more susceptible. Our data did more. Mitchell provided an explanation for this discrepancy. The P-38 featured twin engines, allowing pilots to shut down a single engine if its cooling system failed, and still complete their journey on the remaining power. This redundancy provided significant safety advantages. In contrast, the P-51 relied solely on one engine. Any failure of its cooling system left no backup option. Additionally, the coolant lines for the P-38 ran internally through its booms, while those of the P-51 traversed open fuselage bays, leaving them more susceptible to damage. Each design decision that enhanced the speed and efficiency of the P-51 mines increased its vulnerability. It was an unavoidable trade-off. The Packard Merlin engine powering the P-51 was a remarkable engineering achievement. With 12 cylinders arranged in a V formation, it boasted a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. At altitudes up to 30,000 feet, this engine could still generate over 2,000 horsepower. The supercharger compressed thin air at high altitudes, forcing more oxygen into the cylinders and maintaining performance levels where other engines would falter. However, this process generated intense heat. The air exiting the second stage of the supercharger could be up to 2,000 degrees hotter than when it entered. To prevent overheating and potential engine damage from detonation, a sophisticated intercooler system was necessary. Coolant circulated through passages within the supercharger housing, absorbing excess heat from the compressed air before being routed to the radiator where the heat was dissipated into the airstream. Without an intercooler, the engine would likely fail within 30 seconds of reaching full power due to detonation. The cooling system was entirely integrated, with the engine coolant and intercooler sharing the same radiator while occupying different compartments. Meanwhile, the oil cooling system had its own radiator positioned ahead of the main one. All three systems relied on airflow through the belly scoop for proper operation. Any obstruction in this airflow could cause all three systems to lose their cooling capacity. A malfunctioning radiator door or debris blocking the radiator could result in overheating across all systems, while a bullet hole in any of the radiators would likely lead to system failure. Pilots had to constantly monitor three critical gauges: engine coolant temperature, oil temperature, and intercooler temperature. The normal range for coolant was between 80 dDd and 90 dDd, with maximum continuous operation at 11.2 dDd. Anything above this indicated an emergency situation. Oil should ideally run from 70 dDd to 80 dDd, but exceeding 100 dD to 80 dDd2 would cause the oil to break down and lose its lubricating properties, leading to engine seizure due to lack of proper oiling rather than overheating. Intercooler temperatures needed to remain below 60 dT, above 80 dT temperature, and causing catastrophic internal damage. Therefore, pilots had to be vigilant about three systems, monitor three gauges, and be aware of three critical failure points, all stemming from a single bullet impact. Pilots quickly learned to identify the telltale signs of cooling system issues. These included a sudden rise in temperature, visible wisps of white vapor from the cockpit, and the unmistakable scent of glycol wafting through the air vents, reminiscent of antifreeze. The moment this aroma filled the cabin, pilots knew they were losing coolant and had to act swiftly. However, there was another critical observation. The Republic 47 Thunderbolt could endure ground fire that would be lethal for a Mustang. Equipped with an air-cooled radial engine, the P-47 lacked coolant systems, radiators, or vulnerable lines, making it highly resilient. Multiple hits on its engine cowling wouldn't ground it. Even if some cylinders were knocked out, the remaining ones kept the aircraft airborne. Mitchell witnessed P-47s returning with cylinder heads blown off and oil streaming from damaged lines, entire sections of the cowling missing, yet the engines still running. The pilots would land safely, shut down, and walk away unharmed. Despite looking like they had been through a meat grinder, these engines continued to function. The P-47 was heavier and less agile at high altitudes, though it had shorter range without drop tanks added. Despite its inferior climb rate, the P-47 could withstand ground fire that would likely destroy a Mustang. One afternoon, Mitchell witnessed a P-47 landing with over 40 bullet holes in its cowling and wings. The pilot casually climbed out, inspected the damage, and reported being hit by ground fire during a strafing run. Remarkably, the engine continued to operate flawlessly without any temperature issues or power loss, just numerous punctures in the aircraft's metal. A thorough count revealed 43 holes, 6 of which penetrated directly into the engine itself. Although the cylinders were dented and one cooling fin was broken, the engine performed perfectly. Mitchell this damage to Rodriguez, who explained that it highlighted the difference between air-cooled and liquid-cooled engines. Air-cooled engines proved more resilient and forgiving. They could sustain significant damage and still function effectively. In contrast, liquid-cooled engines offered superior efficiency and power to weight ratios, but were less durable. A single well-placed hit could render them inoperable. Both pilots and ground crews recognized these distinctions by June 1944, when the 8th Air Force began assigning ground attack missions to P-47 units preferentially. The P-51's continued their escort duties and performed fighter sweeps during missions where they could remain at higher altitudes, minimizing exposure to ground fire. This approach was not officially mandated, but rather a practical decision based on the survivability of the aircraft. In early June, Lieutenant William Davis undertook a strafing mission over France while serving with the 354th Fighter Group, which was among the initial units to receive P-51's. At this point, Davis had completed 21 missions and claimed 4 kills. On June 8, 1944, Lieutenant Davis led his flight in an attack on a German convoy near Caen. The convoy consisted of 6 trucks, 3 staff cars, and 2 motorcycles. Approaching from the west at 2,000 feet, they began their assault by opening fire. Davis's bullet struck the lead truck, causing it to explode immediately. The remaining vehicles scattered in different directions. While pulling up to make another pass, Davis experienced a sudden impact. A sharp crack was heard beneath the right side of his cockpit as the temperature gauge rapidly climbed from 98 degrees to 100 degrees. Davis alerted everyone to the issue. Coolant began pouring out immediately. He maintained his altitude and steered westward towards the coastline. After 30 seconds, a visible vapor trail emerged. A thick white glycol mist emanated from beneath the plane's intake scoop. Davis reduced engine power to its minimum setting. Despite this, the temperature remained constant at 10:09 degrees. His base in Lashendon was still 90 miles away, a journey that would take him approximately 20 minutes at his current speed. As he continued flying, the temperature rose to 10:09 degrees, which was approaching the maximum allowed limit. Davis manually opened the radiator flap using an emergency handle, causing the temperature to drop back down to 10:06 degrees. At this point, he was only 60 miles from base, with about 15 minutes of flight time remaining. The temperature then increased to 1010 degrees, reaching its peak allowable limit. Davis kept engine power steady as he flew over another 50 miles toward his destination, estimating the trip would take him around 12 more minutes. As he neared base, the temperature climbed to 1002 degrees. He could hear the engine operating poorly and felt a noticeable vibration through the control stick. With just 40 miles left to go and roughly 10 minutes of flight time remaining, the temperature read 1120 degrees. At 30 miles out with only 8 minutes until arrival, he continued monitoring the situation closely. The engine was now roaring loudly, audible even over the wind, with the temperature hitting 116 degrees. After 6 minutes of flying at an altitude of 20 meters, the gauge spiked to 1180 degrees. The airfield came into view. Davis estimated it was 15 miles away and would take 5 more minutes to reach. As the engine's temperature surpassed its maximum limit, signs of failure in the cylinder heads were evident. At 10 miles out with only 4 minutes left until reaching the airfield, the propeller began to windmill, followed by a complete engine seizure that brought an abrupt silence. Davis adjusted his aircraft for optimal glide distance at 40 axis. With sufficient altitude and range, he realized he could make it to the runway. With 8 miles and 3 minutes of gliding time remaining, Davis crossed over the airfield boundary at 300 feet. He deployed the landing gear and touched down near the midpoint of the runway before coming to a halt. Shaking hands as he climbed out of the cockpit, he noticed steam emanating from the cowling. Despite his ordeal, a punctured coolant line caused by a rifle bullet that had left him just 13 minutes away from disaster, he managed to survive. The following morning, Mitchell examined Davis's aircraft for damage. A small caliber bullet, likely a 7.92 Minute round from a German rifle, entered the aircraft's belly near the radiator intake. Although not a direct hit, it created an opening no larger than a grain of rice, which was sufficient to drain the cooling system within 13 minutes. As a result, the engine suffered catastrophic damage, 2 cylinder heads cracked, 3 valve seats detached, and all 12 pistons became severely scored due to inadequate cooling. Oh! The Merlin engine was now beyond repair. However, this incident was just one of many losses incurred by the 8th Air Force between April and August 1944, when they lost a total of 56 P-51 aircraft. Approximately 41% of these were destroyed during strafing missions, with most casualties attributed to cooling system damage. The statistics clearly indicated that the vulnerability was significant, but no measures had been taken to address it. In late July 1944, Edgar Schmood, a North American aviation engineer and chief designer of the P-51 aircraft, including its airframe, wings, and cooling systems, visited Devon to inspect combat damage and discuss performance issues with pilots. Mitchell encountered Schmood at the repair area, where 3 damaged P-51's were waiting for maintenance. All 3 aircraft suffered from damaged cooling systems and were struck by ground fire. Each incident nearly cost their pilots their lives. Mitchell took Schmoud through the extent of the damage, pointing out punctured coolant lines, fractured header tanks, and perforated radiators. He detailed his observations over the past 4 months, during which 14 pilots from his squadron had perished due to cooling system malfunctions caused by single hits. Schmoud listened intently, examining the wreckage closely and inquiring about combat reports, flight altitudes, and types of ground fire encountered. His next statement caught Mitchell off guard. Schmoud revealed that he was already aware of this vulnerability. He explained it was a design compromise. The cooling system had to be lightweight, efficient, and compact to fit within the airframe without causing additional drag. This led to thin aluminum tubing and exposed radiators with no protective armor. Any attempt to safeguard the cooling system would have resulted in a heavier, slower aircraft with reduced maneuverability. The P-51 lacked the necessary range to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin. It wasn't the P-51, according to Schmoud. The initial assumption had been that P-51 pilots would maintain altitude and avoid ground fire, focusing instead on leveraging their speed and range over armor protection. However, combat reality diverged from these expectations. Pilots were engaging in low-altitude flights, strafing targets, and exposing themselves to enemy gunfire, which led to issues with the cooling system. When Mitchell questioned if there was a viable solution, Schmoud replied that no immediate fix was possible. Re-engineering the cooling system would require an extensive redesign effort spanning several months. By then, the war might be over. Mitchell pressed for guidance on what pilots should do in the meantime. Schmoud advised avoiding ground attack missions when feasible, maintaining high altitudes, and minimizing exposure to small arms fire. Mitchell found this unsatisfactory, arguing that these were limitations rather than solutions, effectively telling pilots they couldn't perform their duties due to aircraft vulnerabilities. Schmoud had no counter-argument and departed for Debden the following day, with Mitchell never seeing him again afterward. Schmoud must have submitted a report since 3 weeks later, a technical bulletin arrived addressing the issue. This document recognized the vulnerability of the cooling system and advised checking coolant lines for combat damage. It also recommended reinforcing all connections with additional clamps and reducing engine power immediately if there was any suspicion of damage to the cooling system in order to prolong the time before an engine failure. However, The bulletin did not provide a definitive solution. It merely identified the issue and urged pilots to exercise caution. Rodriguez read through the bulletin and discarded it, while Mitchell filed it alongside other maintenance documents that he never bothered to review. The real issue was not a lack of awareness about the problem, but rather an inherent weakness in the aircraft that could not be easily rectified. By September 1944, the dynamics of aerial warfare over Europe had changed dramatically. The Luftwaffe's capabilities were severely diminished, and German fighter planes were being destroyed more quickly than they could be rebuilt or replaced. Allied bombers now enjoyed greater freedom to roam across Germany without significant opposition. P-51 pilots achieved remarkable kill counts, both in air-to-air engagements and ground strafing missions against enemy airfields. In September alone, P-51 pilots managed to destroy over 400 German aircraft on the ground. However, these victories came at a high price. The 8th Air Force suffered losses of 78 P-51s that month, with 501 of those casualties occurring during strafing operations when pilots encountered enemy fire that compromised their cooling systems, resulting in the deaths or disappearances of 501 pilots. These statistics painted an unambiguous and grim picture. P-51 pilots could gain supremacy in aerial dogfights. However, when they ventured low and targeted ground objectives, their vulnerability became apparent. It was a risk that no amount of expertise, strategy, or bravery could mitigate. A single bullet posed an existential threat to them. Lieutenant Robert Hayes completed 43 additional missions following his emergency landing in May. On November 3, 1944, Hayes participated in a strafing operation near Kassel, where he made 2 runs and destroyed a locomotive along with damaging several freight cars. On his 3rd run, he was hit by enemy fire from the ground. He promptly reported the issue: coolant leaking, temperature rising. 2 hours later, British troops discovered him with a broken ankle, though he was otherwise unharmed. Evacuated to England, Hayes never flew combat missions again. 3 months after his disappearance, advancing Allied troops discovered Mitchell's P-51, which had crashed nose first at 400 MPS with its cooling system completely drained. Mitchell remained at Debden throughout the duration of the conflict, until May 1945, where he serviced P-51s up until the final mission. His duties included checking coolant levels, pressure testing header tanks, and double clamping every connection to ensure optimal performance of the cooling systems. Despite his diligent efforts, however, he couldn't fortify them against bullet damage. During World War II in Europe, the 8th, 9th, and 15th Air Forces collectively lost approximately 2,005 P-51 Mustangs in combat operations. Of these losses, 41% were attributed to strafing missions, most of which resulted from cooling system failures. The precise tally of pilots who perished due to cooling system damage is unavailable. However, Mitchell meticulously tracked casualties within his own squadron and documented that 19 pilots succumbed or vanished after sustaining hits to their cooling systems, pilots whose survival might have been ensured had the aircraft been capable of enduring even a single bullet hole. Its agility also enabled it to outmaneuver Germany's most skilled pilots in aerial combat. Nevertheless, its liquid-cooled engine rendered it vulnerable to a single small arms round, ultimately claiming hundreds of Allied lives. Following the cessation of hostilities, Mitchell relocated back to Los Angeles. In 1940, he established a garage and spent 4 decades fixing cars while enjoying his meals. He rarely spoke of the P-51s. If questioned, he simply stated that he worked as a mechanic on aircraft, but shared no further details. After the war ended, Hayes relocated to Iowa, where he married his high school sweetheart, fathered 3 children, and pursued a career as a commercial pilot for 37 years. Throughout these decades, Parker remained ever present in his thoughts. Each April 21st, memories of the young pilot who vanished over Germany with an overheating engine surfaced. Rodriguez continued serving in the Air Force until 1963, when he retired at the rank of Master Sergeant and dedicated himself to training jet engine mechanics. Over the years, he imparted the same tale to every novice crew chief: the story of the P-51's cooling system, which could turn a magnificent aircraft into a death trap for its pilots. He recounted how 1 members of his squadron lost their lives due to this critical vulnerability. In 1991, an aviation historian delved into records and combat reports from England concerning P-51 losses and discovered mentions of the cooling system's weaknesses. This researcher then utilized veteran registries to locate Mitchell, who was still working part-time in his garage at age 74. The historian sought confirmation regarding these documented issues. Mitchell acknowledged that the historical accounts were accurate, revealing that the P-51 indeed faced this significant risk and mechanics were well aware of it. Each pilot was aware of it. No one could do anything about it. According to historical analysis, cooling system failures following battle damage resulted in roughly 500 to 600 P-51 losses throughout the conflict. The majority perished or were captured as prisoners of war. Had the P-51 been designed with redundant cooling systems, shielded coolant lines, or an air-cooled engine, many lives might have been saved. However, such modifications would have transformed the aircraft into something else entirely, likely heavier, slower, and less effective. The P-51's design was a mix of strengths and weaknesses, defining its character in both positive and negative ways. His obituary highlighted his service as an aircraft mechanic during World War II, but omitted details about the 19 pilots he witnessed dying, the coolant systems he inspected daily, and his efforts to maintain those systems despite their inherent risks. Today, his garage in Los Angeles has a new owner, though it retains its historical significance. Inside the back office, a faded photograph captures a young mechanic dressed in coveralls, standing beside a P-51 Mustang. The inscription on the back reads, April 1944, England. This image encapsulates the vulnerability present in wartime scenarios. At times, the most powerful weapons carry significant vulnerabilities. The feature that makes an aircraft exceptional can also make it vulnerable. For instance, while the P-51 Mustang was capable of escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, a single bullet hitting its cooling system could prove fatal. Many Allied pilots lost their lives due to this critical vulnerability. This is the reality often overlooked about the P-51 Mustang. It was unmatched in the skies yet vulnerable to even minor damage. If you found this narrative as intriguing as we did, please consider liking the video. It aids us in sharing more untold stories from World War II. Our audience ranges from Texas to Tasmania, uniting veterans and history buffs alike in a community that cherishes these narratives. Thank you for joining us and helping preserve these important stories.